Hello, and welcome to what I am assuming is going to be the last part of Extra History's series on William McKinley. Uh, Pretty simple at this point. We've discussed the imperialism that occurs during the period, the debates, and the structure around it. We discussed his pre-presidential era in the first video. Today, we're talking about the end of his life. Some more of his more domestic policies, and ultimately the assassination that kind of overshadows the rest of his presidency. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at the last episode of William McKinley by Extra History.
One last time, we return to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, September 6th, 1901. President McKinley is famous for his efficiency in reception lines. He can shake hundreds of hands per hour, guiding each person past. But this volume puts Secret Service on alert. They've even brought in extra agents and U.S. Army soldiers. Standing in the Exposition's Temple of Music, a performance hall, they scan the massive line. Because in the last 3 years, anarchist assassins have killed both the Empress of Austria and the King of Italy. Anarchist publications have also identified McKinley as an enemy of the poor and downtrodden.
It's been a big issue toward the end of the 1800s. There is a large amount of anarchist activity, and anarchism, while a political ideology, fine, and there is a very strong contingent of violent anarchism around that turn of the century, where they want to completely remove governmental structures by eliminating the heads of state or the governmental entities that control things. And yeah, there's a number of different world leaders assassinated by anarchists. This is one of the big reasons why we see a big crackdown in the early 1900s on the ideology and their followers and practitioners.
And tonight,
Also, that is such a big issue. The problem of large crowds and political leaders. At this point, we are, this is 36 years post assassination of Lincoln, who was the first individual killed, the first American president killed. Then we see another one in the form of James Garfield, only about 15 years later. And now we are up to McKinley. It's been a habit, it's been a trend the last couple decades of assassination attempts and successful assassinations.
agents are
Although Garfield really should have survived.
especially nervous about a tall black man waiting in line and are giving him extra scrutiny. Though it really is the man with an injured hand just ahead of him that should be their concern. He was waiting when McKinley exited his carriage yesterday. He'd attended McKinley's speech the night before and tried to get close to the stage. And his bandage conceals not a wound, but a pistol.
And that was a really smart way for him to hide that. Nobody's really going to question a cast, and that makes it easier for him to approach the stage without too much scrutiny early on in this portion.
This headline-making episode is brought to you by Ground News, my personal go-to for navigating today's chaotic media landscape, and who we thank for supporting today's historical tale. With the close of the Spanish-American War and the decision to govern the Philippines directly, it initially appeared that McKinley was done with projecting force into the Pacific and Asia. Actually, he was just getting started.
Yeah.
See, as America was setting up shop,
We're going to get into like the Boxer Rebellion, the open door letters, and the impacts that has in China, which is very cool. I'm excited about this.
in the Philippines, other powers were moving into China in the wake of the First Sino-Japanese War. These nations wrung economic concessions, intimidating Qing China into leasing portions of its territory or outright seized peninsulas and large areas. The biggest culprits were China's neighbors, Russia and Japan.
Yeah, and you'll notice those two countries are, as I pointed out, neighbors. It's much easier to take and hold territory when you don't have to march an ocean away. That's why Britain kind of maintains just on Hong Kong and the surrounding peninsulas and upriver with their riverboats. They don't want to try to hold on to it as a vast region. Uh, Going back to someone else that he had mentioned, the First Sino-Japanese War. Or, in that case, Japan and China had gone to war. That's what ends up getting Japan their control over Taiwan and the Ryukyu Islands, I believe, and a few other areas. And that is a big deal. It also shows that China at this point has become really weak. China's only a few decades away from collapsing, their traditional government collapsing, and they have, while attempting to modernize, not gotten there. It's such a large bureaucracy and such a large structure, it takes too long for them to actually adapt and alter to combat new threats. And ultimately, things end up going south quickly.
This worried McKinley for a number of reasons. First being, access to China was the reason America created its bridge of territories across the Pacific.
Yep,
McKinley wanted to extract goods and resources and gain access to sell American goods to the theoretically massive Chinese market. And if the great powers carved up China, they could use their influence to freeze America out by playing favorites with tariffs, denying them the use of ports, or charging American companies higher rates for using European or Japanese-built railways.
And this is an old strategy. To a more extreme extent, back in the 1700s and early 1800s, mercantilism had ruled the day, where pretty much if you are going to buy something in the British colonies in the 1760s before the Revolution breaks out, it was going to have to be a British good. It was going to have to come from England. And that made things specifically expensive, prohibitively expensive, because of the... Sorry. It became prohibitively expensive because of the monopolistic structure. And a lot of different empires did this. And while things became more refined with time, it didn't stop. It just kind of evolved. And that's how we get to this point where the U.S. isn't going to go and trade in India in 1880. That's British markets. Russia and Britain effectively split Iran, or Persia at this time, eventually Iran. But you see where I'm going with this. It's very common for a group to take over a region and then effectively give themselves exclusive marketing rights, therefore reaping in all the profit rather than allowing others to come in and gain.
Though McKinley also opposed this on cultural grounds. Despite both popular racism and America barring Chinese immigrants via the Chinese Exclusion Act, American elites tended to admire Chinese history, culture, and artwork. And there was a real fear that carving up China, as the great powers had divided Africa, would destroy China's cultural legacy. So McKinley leaned on his Secretary of State to create one of the most pivotal foreign policy documents in the history of the United States, the Open Door Policy. Circulated to the great powers in September of 1899. It argued that all the powers must respect Chinese territorial integrity, have equal access to markets, and standardize tariff and transport rates. While this gained reluctant agreement among the powers, the damage of interventionism had already been done. Foreign economic exploitation, colonialist behavior, and the rise in Western missionaries and Christian converts in China had triggered the formation of a pseudo-religious rebel group.
Oh, goodness. What is it? The Society of Harmonious Fists, a.k.a. the Boxers in most of the West. But at this point, yeah, much of that had already occurred. There was already strong divisions amongst China and as to which European power had the most influence. Some regions had strong German connections. Some had strong Dutch, Japanese, British, French. The Portuguese held Macau. So it's already kind of been carved up. And at this point, less so to do with the direct colonization or the direct attempts of imperialism and expansionism, we also see the arrival and expansion of Western religion. Christianity had started to become very popular. And it wasn't just popular, it was revolutionary in the earlier part of the 1800s. The Taiping Rebellion had largely been sparked over religious conflict. The leader of that revolution had argued that he was a sibling to Jesus Christ and that he was the rightful ruler of China through divine right, and ultimately sparked one of the deadliest wars in Chinese history in the form of the Taiping Rebellion. So by the time we hit the end of the 1800s, it's widely frowned upon by a lot of more traditionalist Chinese leaders. We can actually see a similar backlash back in the Tokugawa era of Japan, because after the Sengoku Jidai, one of the reasons why they argued that the Warring States period happened in the first place was the arrival of European technology and religion. And that had driven a wedge in the Japanese people and led to conflict, which led to the Japanese outlawing the practice of Christianity and making it impossible or straight up impossible for people to openly and publicly practice like this. So you can see a lot of parallels.
Calling themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, they held rallies that featured demonstrations of kung fu, vows to kill foreigners, and claims that bullets couldn't harm them. Westerners in China derisively nicknamed them the Boxers.
By the way, that's a weirdly common reality in a lot of this. A lot of more religious-backed ones, a lot of religious organizations, when they push back, they'll make more audacious claims like that. The Mahi Mahi Rebellion in East Africa against the Germans argued that the Special Mahi Mahi had made them invulnerable to European bullets. It didn't, but that adrenaline and the support that brought into people was very powerful on its own. All right. All right. Back to the Boxers.
Scorn quickly turned to horror as the group led an uprising that massacred missionaries and Chinese converts and besieged foreigners inside the walled European-style neighborhoods in larger cities.
Yep.
McKinley's open-door policy became intertwined with a developing war as the great powers began to draw up troops for an Allied intervention while also eyeing how to seize more of China. Believing that the alliance would start carving up China, McKinley joined the Eight-Nation Alliance as a moderating influence and quickly rerouted troops from the Philippines to China. Indeed, the U.S. Marines scaling the walls of Beijing, the first to enter the imperial capital, became an enduring image of the conflict. And from afar, it looked quite tidy. Yet another splendid little war. But like with the Philippines and the Spanish-American War, the long-term reality was neither as splendid nor tidy as it appeared.
Now, that Boxer Rebellion basically set up what would eventually lead to the collapse of the dynastic system that had led China for millennia at this point, and lead to its disastrous warlord era in the teens, and then the broader Chinese civil war between the nationalists and the communists in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and eventually leading to the rise of Mao and the Chinese Communist Party that now runs the country post-1947.
First, the Boxer Protocol, the resulting treaty, saddled China with a heavy indemnity that accelerated the Qing dynasty's decline and left it more vulnerable to foreign powers. And within a decade...
Now, one thing I do want to point out, the U.S. actually, I believe, if not the entirety of it, a decently large portion of it, sent their indemnity back to fund education. Now, that's not the entirety of it, I don't believe, but a decent portion.
Two powers of the alliance, Japan and Russia, were fighting over Chinese possessions.
The
America,
Russo-Japanese
now
War occurs
poised
in
at the start of the
1905.
20th century as China's protector, and with a footprint in the Pacific, was steered towards a collision with Japan. Meanwhile, the vast Chinese market never materialized since the population of China was largely too poor to buy American goods.
Yep.
Then you have the behavior of US troops during the Boxer Rebellion, who looted the Summer Palace in Beijing and often abused Chinese civilians, wounds inflicted that are still present to this day.
Well, think about this. A lot of those Marines that are coming into China are coming directly out of the conflict in the Philippines that we already discussed. The brutal, destructive war that was occurring there, the guerrilla conflict. So by the time they reach China, they have basically established themselves as brutal fighters, and as exactly this. It's what came with the territory with the Philippine War, and now you've unleashed it on another region and another nation that is going to hurt the image of the United States in the region.
And the Boxer Rebellion features prominently in Chinese history education as an example of why the country should beware of Western imperialism. McKinley also set a dark precedent when he ordered troops to China, becoming the first president to circumvent Congress when deploying the military into a war, a type of executive branch overreach that quickly became normalized. And
it has continued to be normalized. Most of the time when U.S. troops are deployed, pretty much anywhere, now, it's deployed and then Congress gives the okay afterward. Now, how that deployment occurs, there are certain laws and protocols that have been established especially since the Vietnam War, but yeah, it's a big piece.
There was discomfort with all this. A lot of Americans had voted for McKinley based on domestic issues. Instead, he'd spent most of his first term acquiring new territories and intervening in China. Moreover, many of the emotional reasons his administration had used to initiate these conflicts were not addressed. Cuba was not so much freed as it was becoming beholden to America. In the Philippines, U.S. combat deaths were now over 10 times the amount suffered during the Spanish-American War.
With hotels.
All right. So, yeah, there's a few big pieces with this, and you can tell that things are not working out great. The Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution effectively turned Cuba into an American protectorate against the broader wishes and desires of the Cuban people. The grueling, long-term guerrilla warfare in the Philippines, where the Filipino guerrillas had the numbers advantage, the terrain advantage, and the experience advantage, was devastating for American troops. Not to mention the use of concentration camps, which was a big piece of why we got involved in the Spanish-American War in the first place. Things end up looking very bad, especially internationally for people.
U.S. commanders increasingly used the same tactics that had spurred public outrage when Spain employed them in Cuba. Ultimately, between 200,000 and 250,000 Filipinos would die in the conflict, mostly civilians killed by disease and starvation, and swinging back to China, despite a lot of the noise made about protecting missionaries in the lead up to the Boxer Rebellion, the negotiations following the conflict focused on commercial issues. This meant that despite being massively popular due to two military victories, McKinley went into the election of 1900 with a couple of big vulnerabilities, and stepping up once again to exploit them was his old opponent, William Jennings Bryan.
William Jennings Bryan reminds me, just in terms of his attempts to run for president, quite a lot like Henry Clay. He's a perennial almost. He almost becomes president. He's almost over that line, and he never manages to quite get there. Spoiler alert, he loses to McKinley here. He lost in 1896, in 1900, and then he will come back to face off against Taft in 1908 and lose again.
Starting off, Bryan hit McKinley with the old economic and currency issues, but that held little weight since McKinley had already won the argument. One of McKinley's first acts upon being inaugurated had been to reinstate the tariffs Grover Cleveland had lowered, bringing them back up to around 49%. But McKinley was more targeted about it than in 1890. While this did increase domestic production in some industries like steel, it also did raise prices, particularly for industries like construction and railroads. In fact, this increase in particularly steel began to suggest to McKinley that the tariffs had done their work and that global trade was the next economic horizon. Similarly, he'd experimented early in his presidency with mixing silver supply into the gold standard, but other nations he spoke to about a unified effort weren't keen. And the whole thing was rendered moot when rich gold strikes around the world increased the global gold supply. Thus, he finally reaffirmed the gold standard in 1900 and pegged the dollar to its price.
Yeah, McKinley's not a dumb dude. He is willing to experiment and see what works. Like they pointed out, he thinks that the tariff experiment is done, that American efforts had been boosted enough that now we could focus on international trade and global trade for the benefit of not just us, but others. Bimetallism had been a big sticking point all the way back in 1896. The idea of flooding the market with silver to artificially inflate the US dollar to give Western farmers a better shake at things and more relief from higher crop sales. They could then pay off their debts and be better off. But ultimately, like they pointed out, when you find a ton more gold internationally, suddenly you don't need to mix it in. And while bimetallism has its possible perks, the general idea of maintaining a singular monetary system tends to be simpler and therefore easier to manage than a bimetal system. We don't know how that would have worked out. Bimetallism never gets majorly employed in American politics at this point. We've actually looked at it previously, how increase in silver purchases by the U.S. government during the early 1890s and late 1880s ends up leading to push toward the crash in the early 1890s.
But while America's rapid economic expansion, partially due to its new territories, partially due to a manufacturing boom, had softened the blows of the tariffs, they often were hard on small businesses. The ones that could survive the shock of higher prices were the big corporate structures known as the trusts, who ruled over Gilded Age America.
Which helps force and push monopolization that's going to be so central to Teddy Roosevelt's and Howard Taft's trust-busting efforts.
And that was actually McKinley's biggest political vulnerability. He was largely a creature of big business, and Bryan went after him as being in the pocket of business tycoons. He threaded this in with the narrative about McKinley's imperialist presidency, playing on that image of him as Napoleon, and questioning moves like McKinley's puzzling decision to leave the office of the vice president empty when Gary Hobart suddenly died in November of 1899. Despite his strong position, McKinley's camp did worry that Bryan's populist attacks were landing.
Yeah, it's a very big deal for a lot of those. Although, as you'll end up seeing, it doesn't have the effect that it's quite pushing for. And McKinley is going to pick a very strong populist voice when it comes to his next run as his VP. That's really going to help push him over that finish line.
Well, I mean, there was some truth to them. McKinley did many things in his presidency, but in a domestic sense, he was not fulfilling America's most pressing need. Because this was the dawn of the progressive era, one where America would put its shoulder behind industrialization, but also champion social causes, like union protections, breaking up monopolies, labor rights, women's rights, and child labor. But McKinley, to put it mildly, was just not that guy. In fact, while he had campaigned as the friend of the workers and a progressive voice, McKinley consistently proved more talk than action. He'd privately say he was for women's suffrage and even court women's lobby groups, but then wouldn't take a public position. He'd spoken strongly against lynching as governor, but as president, when an armed white supremacist mob overthrew the biracial government of Wilmington, North Carolina, killing up to 300 people and expelling the city's black population, he said nothing.
Yeah, and that's a big kind of through line throughout this period. There is a lot of talk, a lot of push for civil rights, for change, that never ends up materializing. And it's going to consistently occur. We're going to see it takes another 20 years just about to get women's suffrage through the states for the constitutional amendment. It takes a hot minute. And a lot of these social causes just were not his focus. If we go back even to his time in Congress, he was always an economics guy, not a social justice guy.
Instead, he courted Southern votes in the 1900 election by wearing a gray badge to show his sympathy with the Confederate dead, and promised to bring Confederate cemeteries under federal jurisdiction. Simultaneously, he did invite black members of Congress to serve as his advisors privately, and appointed a large number of black postmasters, which is not nothing, especially since at this time, local postmasters were big figures locally and often operated their mail, banking, and notary services out of their home. By appointing African Americans to the role, McKinley was creating a context where whites would need to visit the home of a black public official and treat them with respect.
Well, think about this. This is pre-internet. This is pre-common telephone. If you wanted to get a message a long way, you had to go through the post office. The post office is the most public-facing part of the federal government at this point in American history. And so when you specifically put a black postmaster in these different regions, if someone was really going to be enough of a problem that they refuse to work with them, guess who's not getting their mail shipped? Guess who's not getting their stuff notarized? They deserve to not get their stuff notarized if they're going to be that much of a problem. But also, it forces this interaction. And we actually see this through a lot of different things. Individuals will be in opposition to something until they're really immersed in it or until they get used to it. There is an idea that individuals who spend time around those that are different than them become more akin to and more supportive of their ideas, their beliefs, and what they want to do than if they didn't spend time around them. Because if they didn't spend time around them, they could ignore the better aspects and just try to create bad sentiment or bad ideas around them.
Then flipping that coin on its third side, he never pushed back about the increasing restrictions on the black population of the Jim Crow South.
And remember, this is right around the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, which is going to legally protect Southern Jim Crow laws, Southern segregationist laws as separate but equal. It's nonsense, and it's eventually agreed upon by the Supreme Court that it's nonsense, but that became the law of the land during this time period, and it is going to have horrific consequences for decades to come.
Even when one of his postmasters was murdered, he did not speak out. But McKinley's camp thought there was a way to capture some of that rising progressive appetite for reform, as well as further burnish his military achievements and gain an advocate for expansionism by drafting progressive voice, Rough Rider war hero, and rabid imperialist Theodore Roosevelt as his new vice president.
And that was probably the smartest thing he did in his second campaign. And Roosevelt was a rising star. He had gained national fame for effectively quitting the federal government and going to serve in the Spanish-American War. And he had been such a vocal opponent of the trusts and a vocal proponent for social reforms when he was the governor of New York and when he had held other offices prior to that. Not just that, but there's the added side effect that the vice president, unless you die, is effectively a worthless position. And so not only could he cater his favor in promoting himself as the president, he could also then drown out any of the other ideas that he didn't like from Teddy and allow himself to maintain that control.
Also, it would get Roosevelt out of New York politics, where he was becoming a nuisance with his reform crusades and feuds with the Tammany Hall political machine. Roosevelt joining the ticket reinforced McKinley's weaknesses and gave him an exciting advocate who could match Bryan's energetic speaking tours.
Okay, if this...
Because, well, fine, he was not nearly as much of an orator as Jennings Bryan or Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a powerhouse orator. And he maintained that sway for a long time.
It cinched the election for McKinley, but, as longtime confidant Mark Hanna put it, placed the madman Roosevelt one heartbeat from the presidency. Which brings us nicely back to the Temple of Music at the World's Fair on September 6th, 1901. Less than a year into McKinley's second term, he'd come to this celebration of his achievement. This Pan-American Exposition with its exhibits on emerging technology, manufacturing, and America's new colonial possessions. His security...
It should have been a victory lap, and instead it ended up being the end of his presidency. Now, given he would eventually die, he doesn't actually die that night. He ends up dying of an infection, I believe, as a direct result of Czolgosz's shot. But
Detail wanted to cancel this greeting line for being too dangerous. After all, the anarchist who had killed King Umberto I of Italy the previous year had been an Italian immigrant who volunteered and trained for the killing in New Jersey. McKinley answered, "Who would want to hurt me?" He reaches out for the next person in line, a man with a bandaged hand. His name is Leon Czolgosz, a Polish-American man born in Detroit. A former steelworker, he had become disillusioned with America's economic model after witnessing a series of bloody strikes. Czolgosz...
Throughout the end of the 1800s, we see a number of strikes get put down by strike breakers, by the Pinkertons, even by the National Guard. And we'd seen problems like at the Knights of Labor's march on Haymarket Square. Somebody had set off bombs. Things were not looking good. Things were going poorly overall.
Quit complaining of poor health and moved home to stew in isolation, reading increasingly radical anarchist literature. Months before, he had stalked the country's most prominent anarchist, Emma Goldman, and briefly met her twice. To Czolgosz, McKinley represented the worst of America. The rising gap between the rich and poor, the greed of the trusts, and the horrible war crimes he'd begun reading about in the Philippines. He raises the pistol. Czolgosz fires twice before the crowd jumps him. The first to take him down being the large man behind him the Secret Service had flagged as problematic. And the crowd might have beat him to death right there, except McKinley, not realizing how badly he'd been wounded, begged for them to go easy. McKinley was rushed to the expedition's bare-bones hospital clinic, but there was no one qualified to operate on him. The nearest gunshot expert, it turned out, was engaged in a delicate cranial surgery at that very moment, and stated that he could not stop even to help the President of the United States. The two doctors who treated McKinley had no history with gunshot wounds.
And this is what's going to kill him. It's the failure here. The inability to actually properly treat it.
And the surgery itself proved difficult. The president was a big man, and while they extracted one bullet, finding the other would have involved digging nearly elbow deep into his abdomen and removing his stomach and intestines. So they sewed him up and hoped for the best.
And realistically, they did what they could with what they had. They did not have the expertise, they did not have the tools. They did what they could. But ultimately, infection is going to take McKinley. modern medicine, he would have probably been fine, which sucks. He could have survived the wounds.
At first, McKinley appeared to strengthen, yet 5 days in, he showed clear indications of gangrene, and there was nothing to be done. 8 days after being shot, William McKinley died, with Ida at his side, singing the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Her mental health, already fragile, could not stand up to the grief, and she was unable to attend the funeral or his internment. The country entered a period of national mourning, draping his portrait in black and fundraising for an enormous tomb and memorial in his hometown of Canton, Ohio.
Yep.
Would join him there 6 years after his death. Leon Czolgosz, for his part, was nearly lynched before standing trial and proved a poor firebrand, failing to make any dramatic statement in court or to newspapers. The jury voted him guilty with such speed, they waited to re-enter the courtroom to suggest they had considered the question seriously. He went to the electric chair only 7 weeks after the assassination, having achieved nothing except initiating a crackdown on American anarchists.
Yep.
Overshadowed by his more dynamic successor, Roosevelt, McKinley's presidency then faded into obscurity, despite the fact that he had set up one of Roosevelt's principal achievements, beginning negotiations to take over the abandoned French effort to build a canal through Panama. But today, it is clear that McKinley should be remembered as a pivotal figure, the architect of the American century. His name spoken with respect in his hometown, but frequently with less warmth in Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines. A man from Ohio who changed the world, even when he did not mean to. And look,
All right, that was a great series. I'm glad that we were able to check this out. I'll see you in the next video. I'm looking forward to whatever we end up reacting to next. Have a great day. Bye.